When the Henderson family inherited their grandmother's estate in 2019, they expected to find the usual collection of vintage furniture, old china, and faded photographs. What they discovered instead was a single wedding photograph from 1911 that would unravel a mystery spanning over a century and challenge everything they thought they knew about their family history. The photograph showed their great-grandmother Clara in an elaborate wedding dress, standing beside a handsome groom in a formal black suit. But as the family would soon discover, that groom had never existed at all. The Henderson family had always known that their great-grandmother Clara had been a mysterious figure. Born Clara Whitmore in 1889, she had appeared in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania in 1910, with little explanation of her past. She had claimed to be a widow, though no one could recall her ever mentioning a deceased husband by name. She had lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town, supporting herself by taking in sewing and occasionally helping with births and illnesses in the community. Clara had been well regarded by the townspeople, known for her kindness and her skill with medicinal herbs. She had never remarried, despite being an attractive woman in her 20s when she first arrived in Millbrook. When asked about her past, she would simply say that she had come from was back east and change the subject. She had lived in Millbrook for over 60 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1973 at the age of 84. The family had always assumed that Clara's reluctance to discuss her past was simply a product of her generation's tendency toward privacy. Many people in those days preferred not to dwell on painful memories, and the loss of a young husband would certainly qualify as such. But when Clara's great-granddaughter Sarah Henderson began going through the belongings in Clara's old house, she found something that didn't fit with the family's understanding of their ancestors' life. The house had been left to the family when Clara died, but it had been rented out for decades. When the last tenant moved out in 2019, the family finally had the opportunity to clean out the accumulated belongings of several generations. Most of the items were exactly what they expected: furniture from the early 20th century, dishes and linens that had been carefully preserved, and boxes of photographs documenting Clara's life in Millbrook. But in a cedar chest in the master bedroom, Sarah found something that stopped her in her tracks. Wrapped in tissue paper and carefully preserved was a large, formal wedding photograph in an ornate silver frame. The photograph showed a young woman, who was unmistakably Clara, dressed in an elaborate white wedding gown with a long train and intricate beadwork. She was standing beside a tall, handsome man in a formal black suit with tails, his hand resting gently on her arm. The photograph was professionally taken, clearly the work of a skilled studio photographer. The couple was posed in front of an elaborate backdrop, featuring painted columns and drapery, typical of formal wedding portraits from the early 1900s. At the bottom of the photograph, in elegant script, was written, "Faust, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Ashford, June 15, 1911. Sarah stared at the photograph in confusion. According to family records, Clara had been born Clara Whitmore and had never changed her name. There was no mention anywhere in the family's documentation of a Jonathan Ashford, or of Clara ever having been married to anyone by that name. Yet here was clear evidence of a wedding that had apparently taken place in 1911, just 1 year after Clara had arrived in Millbrook. Sarah brought the photograph to her family's attention, and they were equally puzzled. Clara's granddaughter, Margaret Henderson, who was now in her 70s, had spent considerable time with Clara in her later years and had never heard any mention of a husband named Jonathan Ashford. Margaret had always understood that Clara had been widowed young and had come to Millbrook to start a new life, but she had never heard any details about the husband or the circumstances of his death. The family decided to research the photograph and the mysterious Jonathan Ashford to see if they could uncover the truth about Clara's past. They began by examining the photograph itself more closely, looking for any clues that might help them understand when and where it had been taken. The photograph was mounted on heavy cardboard backing, typical of professional studio portraits from the early 1900s. On the back of the mounting was a stamp that read, "Whitman Photography Studio, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." This was the first concrete clue they had about the photograph's origins, and it suggested that Clara had indeed come from Mendes back east, as she had always claimed. Sarah contacted the Historical Society in Philadelphia to see if they had any records of the Whitman Photography Studio. The society was able to confirm that the studio had operated in Philadelphia from 1895 to 1925, and they provided Sarah with the address where the studio had been located. This gave the family a starting point for their research into Clara's life before she came to Millbrook. The family also began researching the name Jonathan Ashford, looking for any records of a man by that name who might have been married to Clara in 1911. They searched marriage records, census data, and newspaper archives, but they could find no trace of anyone named Jonathan Ashford who fit the description of the man in the photograph. This absence of records was puzzling, as marriage records from 1911 were generally well preserved, especially in major cities like Philadelphia. If Clara had indeed married someone named Jonathan Ashford in 1911, there should have been some official record of the ceremony. The lack of any such record suggested that either the marriage had never taken place or that the names in the photograph were not accurate. As the family continued their research, they began to uncover other inconsistencies in Clara's story. According to the 1910 census, there was no record of a Clara Whitmore living in Philadelphia or anywhere else in Pennsylvania. This was unusual, as the 1910 census was considered to be quite comprehensive and accurate. If Clara had been living in Philadelphia in 1910, as the photograph seemed to suggest, she should have appeared in the census records. The family also discovered that there were no birth records for a Clara Whitmore born in 1889 in any of the eastern states where Clara might have originated. This was particularly puzzling, as birth records from that period, while not as comprehensive as modern records, were generally available for people born in major cities and towns. These discoveries led the family to wonder if Clara Whitmore might not have been their great-grandmother's real name. It was not uncommon in the early 1900s for people to change their names when they moved to new locations, especially if they were trying to escape difficult circumstances or start fresh. But if Clara had changed her name, what had her original name been, and why had she felt the need to create a new identity? The family decided to have the photograph examined by a professional to see if they could learn more about its origins and authenticity. They contacted Dr. Michael Thompson, a historian who specialized in early 20th century photography and had experience in authenticating historical documents and images. Dr. Thompson examined the photograph using a variety of techniques, including analysis of the paper and chemicals used in its development, examination of the clothing and props visible in the image, and comparison with other photographs known to have been taken at the Whitman Photography Studio during the same period. His analysis confirmed that the photograph was genuine and had indeed been taken in 1911 at the Whitman Photography Studio in Philadelphia. The clothing worn by both the bride and groom was consistent with formal wedding attire from that period, and the studio's backdrop and props matched those used in other photographs from the same studio and time period. However, Dr. Thompson's examination also revealed something unusual about the photograph. Using high-resolution digital scanning and enhancement techniques, he was able to detect subtle inconsistencies in the image that suggested it might have been manipulated in some way. The most significant anomaly was in the area around the groom's figure. While photographic manipulation was much more limited in 1911 than it is today, it was possible for skilled photographers to create composite images by combining elements from multiple photographs. Dr. Thompson's analysis suggested that the groom's figure might have been added to the photograph after the original image of the bride was taken. This discovery was startling and raised even more questions about the photograph's origins and purpose. If the groom had indeed been added to the photograph, it would explain why there were no records of Jonathan Ashford or of Clara's marriage to him. But it would also raise the question of why Clara would have commissioned such an elaborate deception. Dr. Thompson explained that composite photography was sometimes used in the early 1900s for various purposes. Families might commission composite photographs to include deceased relatives in family portraits, or to create idealized images that didn't reflect reality. In some cases, composite photographs were created for theatrical or artistic purposes, but the creation of a fake wedding photograph was unusual and suggested that Clara had gone to considerable expense and effort to create the illusion of a marriage that had never taken place. This level of deception implied that there was something significant about Clara's real circumstances that she had wanted to hide. The family decided to dig deeper into Clara's background, using the information they had gathered to try to uncover her real identity and the circumstances that had led her to create a false wedding photograph. They hired a professional genealogist, Patricia Williams, who specialized in tracing family histories from the early 20th century. Patricia began by focusing on the Whitman Photography Studio and its records. While the studio itself had closed in 1925, some of its records had been preserved by the Philadelphia Historical Society. These records included appointment books and customer lists that might provide clues about who had commissioned the wedding photograph. The records showed that a woman named Clara Whitmore had indeed visited the studio in June 1911, just as the date on the photograph indicated. However, the appointment book noted that she had come for a Monde special portrait session, rather than a wedding photograph. This terminology was unusual and suggested that the studio had been aware that they were creating something other than a standard wedding portrait. The records also showed that Clara had paid a significant sum for the photograph, much more than would have been typical for a standard wedding portrait. This higher fee was consistent with the creation of a composite image, which would have required additional time and skill from the photographer. Patricia also found records indicating that Clara had requested multiple copies of the photograph, which was unusual for a wedding portrait. Most couples would have ordered only a few copies for family members, but Clara had ordered a dozen copies, suggesting that she had intended to use the photograph for some specific purpose. These discoveries led Patricia to focus her research on women who might have been living in Philadelphia in 1911 under different names. She searched through records of women who had been involved in scandals, crimes, or other circumstances that might have led them to change their identities. After weeks of research, Patricia made a breakthrough. She found records of a woman named Catherine Morrison who had been involved in a highly publicized scandal in Philadelphia in 1910. Catherine had been the daughter of a wealthy businessman, and she had become pregnant out of wedlock, a situation that would have been socially devastating for a family of their standing in 1910. The records showed that Catherine Morrison had disappeared from Philadelphia in late 1910, shortly after the scandal had become public. Her family had claimed that she had gone to stay with relatives in Europe, but there were no records of her ever leaving the country. Patricia suspected that Catherine Morrison might have changed her name to Clara Whitmore and created a new identity to escape the shame of her circumstances. To test this theory, Patricia obtained a photograph of Catherine Morrison from newspaper coverage of the scandal. When she compared this photograph to the wedding portrait of Clara, the resemblance was unmistakable. The woman in both photographs was clearly the same person, despite the different names and circumstances. This discovery solved the mystery of Clara's real identity, but it raised new questions about why she had created the fake wedding photograph. Patricia theorized that Clara, formerly Catherine, had commissioned the photograph to support her new identity as a respectable widow. In 1911, being a widow was much more socially acceptable than being an unmarried mother, and the wedding photograph would have provided evidence of her supposed marriage. The family was fascinated by this revelation about their great-grandmother's past, but they wanted to learn more about what had happened to Catherine Morrison after she had disappeared from Philadelphia. Patricia continued her research, focusing on what had become of Catherine's child and how she had managed to establish her new life in Millbrook. The research revealed that Catherine had indeed given birth to a child in early 1911, shortly before she had commissioned the fake wedding photograph. The child, a daughter, had been born in a home for unwed mothers in Philadelphia, an institution that provided shelter and medical care for women in Catherine's situation. Records from the home showed that Catherine had initially planned to give the child up for adoption, which was the most common course of action for unmarried mothers at that time. However, she had ultimately decided to keep the child, despite the social difficulties this would create. The decision to keep her child had made Catherine's need for a new identity even more urgent. As an unmarried mother, she would have faced constant social stigma and would have had difficulty finding employment or housing. By creating the identity of Clara Whitmore, a respectable widow, she could raise her child without the shame associated with illegitimate birth. The fake wedding photograph had been a crucial part of this deception. It provided visual evidence of Clara's supposed marriage and helped to legitimize her status as a widow. The photograph would have been particularly important when Clara moved to Millbrook. as it would have helped her establish her credibility with the townspeople. Patricia's research also revealed what had happened to Catherine's child. The daughter, who had been named Rose, had been raised by Clara in Millbrook and had lived there until her death in 1945. Rose had never married and had no children, which explained why there were no other family members who might have known the truth about Clara's past. This discovery meant that Rose had been Clara's daughter, not her sister, as the family had always believed. The family had known about Rose, but they had understood her to be Clara's younger sister, who had come to live with her in Millbrook. The truth was that Rose had been Clara's illegitimate daughter, and Clara had maintained the fiction of their relationship as sisters to protect both of their reputations. The family was amazed by the complexity of the deception that Clara had maintained for over 60 years. She had not only created a false identity for herself, but had also concealed the true nature of her relationship with Rose. The fake wedding photograph had been just one element of an elaborate fiction that had allowed Clara to live a respectable life despite the scandal of her past. As the family processed these revelations, they began to understand Clara in a new light. Rather than being simply a mysterious figure from their family's past, she emerged as a woman who had shown remarkable courage and resourcefulness in the face of difficult circumstances. In an era when unmarried mothers faced severe social stigma and limited options, Clara had found a way to create a new life for herself and her daughter. The fake wedding photograph, which had initially seemed like a puzzling deception, now appeared to be a symbol of Clara's determination to protect her family and maintain her dignity. The photograph had served its purpose for over a century, helping Clara to establish and maintain her new identity until her death. The family decided to research the Whitman photography studio further to see if they could learn more about how the composite photograph had been created. They discovered that the studio had been known for its innovative techniques and had been one of the first in Philadelphia to experiment with composite photography. The studio's owner, Harold Whitman, had been a skilled photographer who had trained in Europe and had brought advanced techniques back to America. He had been known for his ability to create realistic composite images, and he had often been commissioned to create memorial portraits that included deceased family members. The records showed that Whitman had been sympathetic to women in difficult circumstances and had sometimes provided his services at reduced rates for those who needed help creating new identities. This explained why he had been willing to help Clara create her fake wedding photograph and why he had charged her a premium for the service. The family also learned that Whitman had been careful to maintain the confidentiality of his clients, especially those who had commissioned unusual or sensitive work. This discretion had helped to protect Clara's secret and had ensured that the truth about the photograph had remained hidden for over a century. As the family continued their research, they discovered that Clara's story was not unique. The early 1900s had been a time of significant social change, and many women had found themselves in situations that required them to create new identities or reinvent their pasts. The Whitman photography studio had apparently helped several women create the documentation they needed to support their new lives. This discovery led the family to research other photographs that had been created by the Whitman studio during the same period. They found evidence of several other composite wedding photographs that had been commissioned by women who appeared to be in similar circumstances to Clara. These photographs all shared certain characteristics. They showed women in elaborate wedding dresses standing beside grooms who appeared to have been added to the images after the fact. The grooms in these photographs all had a slightly artificial quality that was detectable under close examination, suggesting that they had been created using the same techniques that had been used for Clara's photograph. The family realized that they had uncovered evidence of what amounted to a small industry in creating false documentation for women who needed to escape difficult circumstances. The Whitman photography studio had apparently been at the center of this network, providing women with the visual evidence they needed to support their new identities. This discovery added another layer to Clara's story and helped to explain how she had been able to create such a convincing new identity. She had not been acting alone, but had been part of a larger network of women who had found ways to escape the social constraints and stigma of their time. The family decided to contact other descendants of women who might have used similar services to see if they could learn more about this network and how it had operated. Through genealogical websites and historical societies, They were able to connect with several other families who had discovered similar mysteries in their own family histories. These connections revealed a pattern of women who had disappeared from their original communities in the early 1900s and had reappeared elsewhere with new identities and fake documentation. Many of these women had been in situations similar to Clara's: unmarried mothers, women fleeing abusive relationships, or those who had been involved in scandals that had made their original lives untenable. The network had apparently been informal but effective, with women sharing information about photographers, boarding houses, and communities that were welcoming to newcomers with mysterious pasts. The Whitman Photography Studio had been just one resource in this network, but it had been an important one because it could provide the visual documentation that was often necessary to establish credibility in a new community. The family's research also revealed that Clara had maintained contact with some of the other women in this network throughout her life. Letters found in Clara's belongings showed that she had corresponded with several women who had similar stories, and they had provided each other with support and advice over the years. These letters provided additional insight into Clara's character and showed that she had been part of a community of women who had helped each other navigate the challenges of their unconventional lives. The letters revealed that Clara had been generous with her advice and had helped several other women establish new identities when they found themselves in difficult circumstances. One particularly revealing letter, dated 1923, showed that Clara had helped a young woman named Mary escape an abusive marriage by providing her with money and contacts in another state. The letter included instructions on how to create a new identity and recommendations for photographers who could provide the necessary documentation. This letter demonstrated that Clara had not only benefited from the network of women who helped each other escape difficult circumstances, but had also contributed to it by helping others in need. Her experience in creating a new identity had made her a valuable resource for other women who found themselves in similar situations. The family's research also uncovered evidence that Clara had been involved in other activities that supported women in need. Records from the Millbrook community showed that she had often provided medical care and assistance to women during childbirth, and she had been known for her discretion in dealing with sensitive situations. Several records suggested that Clara had helped unmarried women in Millbrook deal with unwanted pregnancies, either by providing medical care or by helping them find adoptive families for their children. This work had been dangerous and could have resulted in legal trouble if it had been discovered, but Clara had apparently felt obligated to help other women who found themselves in circumstances similar to her own. The family began to understand that Clara's life in Millbrook had been shaped by her own experiences as an unmarried mother and her understanding of the challenges faced by women in similar situations. Her willingness to help others had made her a valuable member of the community, even though most people had never known the full extent of her activities. As the family continued to piece together Clara's story, they discovered that she had been remarkably successful in maintaining her false identity throughout her life. She had never been discovered or exposed, despite living in a small community where people paid close attention to each other's affairs. This success had required constant vigilance and careful management of information. Clara had needed to remember the details of her false history and ensure that she never contradicted herself or revealed information that might expose her true past. She had also needed to be careful about maintaining relationships with people who might have known her before she became Clara Whitmore. The fake wedding photograph had been a crucial tool in maintaining this deception. It provided visual evidence of her supposed marriage and helped to deflect questions about her past. When people asked about her late husband, Clara could show them the photograph and provide just enough detail to satisfy their curiosity without revealing too much. The family found evidence that Clara had been careful to limit the amount of information she shared about her supposed husband. She had never provided details about how he had died or where he had been buried, always claiming that the memories were too painful to discuss. This strategy had allowed her to maintain the fiction without having to create elaborate false details that might have been discovered. The research also revealed that Clara had been strategic about the relationships she formed in Millbrook. She had been friendly and helpful to her neighbors, but she had avoided forming close friendships that might have led to deeper scrutiny of her past. She had been particularly careful around other women who might have been more likely to ask probing questions about her history. Despite these precautions, Clara had managed to live a full and meaningful life in Millbrook. She had been respected by her neighbors, had contributed to the community, and had successfully raised her daughter Rose. The fake wedding photograph had helped to make all of this possible by providing her with the social legitimacy she needed to build a new life. The family's research also uncovered evidence that Clara had been aware of the risks she was taking by maintaining her false identity. Letters found among her belongings showed that she had worried about being discovered and had made plans for what she would do if her true identity was ever revealed. One letter, apparently never sent, was addressed to Rose and contained a full confession of Clara's true identity and the circumstances that had led her to create the Clara Whitmore persona. The letter explained that Clara had written it to ensure that Rose would know the truth if something happened to Clara before she could tell her in person. The letter revealed that Clara had planned to tell Rose the truth about their relationship when Rose reached adulthood, but she had never found the right moment to do so. Clara had worried that the revelation might damage Rose's reputation in the community and had ultimately decided to take the secret to her grave. This decision had protected Rose during her lifetime, but it had also meant that the truth about Clara's identity had been lost when both women died. If the family had not discovered the fake wedding photograph, Clara's story might have remained hidden forever. The family's research into Clara's story had taken over 2 years and had involved extensive investigation into historical records, genealogical research, and analysis of the fake wedding photograph. The process had been challenging but rewarding, as it had revealed a fascinating story of courage, resourcefulness, and deception that had been hidden in their family history for over a century. The discovery had also connected them with other families who had similar stories and had helped to shed light on a little-known aspect of women's history in the early 1900s. The network of women who had helped each other escape difficult circumstances and create new identities represented an important but largely undocumented form of mutual aid and support. The family decided to share their findings with historical societies and women's history organizations to help preserve the story and contribute to a better understanding of women's experiences in the early 20th century. They also decided to donate Clara's papers and photographs, including the fake wedding photograph, to a museum that specialized in women's history. The fake wedding photograph, which had initially seemed like a puzzling family mystery, had become a valuable historical artifact that illustrated the lengths to which women had gone to escape social stigma and create better lives for themselves and their children. The photograph represented not just Clara's individual story, but the experiences of countless women who had faced similar challenges and had found creative ways to overcome them. The family's research had also revealed the importance of questioning assumptions about family history and being open to unexpected discoveries. The fake wedding photograph had challenged everything they thought they knew about Clara, but it had ultimately led to a much richer and more complete understanding of her life and character. Clara's story demonstrated that people in the past had been just as complex and resourceful as people today, and that they had often found ways to overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Her willingness to create an entirely new identity and maintain it for over 60 years showed remarkable determination and courage. The fake wedding photograph had served its purpose perfectly, providing Clara with the social legitimacy she needed to build a new life while protecting her daughter from the stigma of illegitimate birth. The photograph had been so convincing that it had fooled not only Clara's contemporaries, but also her own descendants for over a century. The family's discovery of the truth about the photograph had been made possible by advances in technology and research methods that had not been available to previous generations. Digital analysis of the photograph had revealed the subtle signs of manipulation that had been invisible to the naked eye, while online genealogical databases had made it possible to trace connections across time and geography. These tools had allowed the family to uncover a story that might otherwise have remained hidden forever, but the discovery had also required persistence, creativity, and a willingness to question accepted family narratives. The family had needed to be open to the possibility that their understanding of Clara's life had been incomplete or incorrect. The research had also highlighted the importance of preserving family documents and photographs, even when their significance is not immediately apparent. If Clara's descendants had not preserved the fake wedding photograph, the truth about her identity might never have been discovered. The story of Clara's fake wedding photograph had become a testament to the power of historical research and the importance of preserving and investigating family artifacts. It had shown that even seemingly simple family photographs could contain complex stories that revealed important aspects of social and cultural history. The family's experience had also demonstrated the value of connecting with other researchers and families who might have similar stories. The network of descendants who had discovered comparable mysteries in their own family histories had provided valuable support and resources that had helped to piece together Clara's story. As the family reflected on their discoveries, they realized that Clara's story had changed their understanding, not only of their own family history, but also of the broader historical context in which their ancestors had lived. The fake wedding photograph had opened a window into a world of women who had faced difficult choices and had found creative ways to overcome social constraints and stigma. Clara's story had also highlighted the importance of women's networks and mutual support systems in helping individuals navigate challenging circumstances. The informal network of women who had helped each other create new identities and escape difficult situations had been an important but largely invisible form of social support. The family decided to continue their research into Clara's story and the broader network of women who had used similar strategies to create new lives. They hoped to contribute to a better understanding of women's experiences in the early 20th century and to help preserve the stories of women who had shown remarkable courage and resourcefulness in the face of adversity. Through their continued research, the family discovered that the network of women who had helped each other create new identities had been more extensive and organized than they had initially realized. They found evidence of boarding houses that specialized in providing temporary shelter for women in transition, employment agencies that helped women find work without requiring extensive background checks, and even informal banks that provided small loans to help women establish themselves in new communities. This underground network had operated throughout the northeastern United States and had helped hundreds, possibly thousands, of women escape difficult circumstances and create new lives. The network had been particularly active in the years following major social upheavals, such as economic depressions, wars, and periods of rapid social change. The family also discovered that Clara had been more than just a beneficiary of this network. She had been one of its key organizers in the Pennsylvania region. Letters and documents found in her belongings revealed that she had maintained correspondence with women's organizations, reform groups, and charitable institutions throughout her life, often serving as a liaison between women in need and the resources that could help them. One particularly significant discovery was a ledger that Clara had kept, documenting the women she had helped over the years. The ledger contained names, dates, and brief descriptions of the assistance provided, showing that Clara had helped over 200 women during her lifetime. The entries ranged from providing temporary shelter and medical care to helping women create new identities and find employment in distant communities. The ledger revealed that Clara's work had not been limited to helping unmarried mothers. She had also assisted women fleeing abusive marriages, women who had been involved in political activities that had made them targets of persecution, and women who had been ostracized from their communities for various reasons. The diversity of the women Clara had helped demonstrated the breadth of her compassion and her understanding of the many ways that women could find themselves in need of a fresh start. The family's research also uncovered evidence that Clara had been involved in the early women's suffrage movement, though she had been careful to keep her political activities separate from her public persona in Millbrook. Letters from suffrage leaders showed that Clara had provided financial support and safe houses for activists who were traveling through Pennsylvania, and she had helped to organize covert meetings and distribute literature. This political involvement explained some of the skills that Clara had developed in creating and maintaining false identities. The suffrage movement had required its members to be discreet and resourceful, often operating under assumed names and using coded communications to avoid detection by authorities who opposed their activities. The family discovered that Clara's fake wedding photograph had been just one of several false documents that she had commissioned over the years. She had also obtained fake birth certificates, employment references, and even medical records that she had used to help other women establish new identities. The Whitman Photography Studio had been just one part of a larger network of professionals who had been willing to provide these services. This network had included lawyers who specialized in helping women change their names legally, doctors who would provide medical care without asking too many questions, and employers who were willing to hire women without extensive background checks. The network had been held together by a combination of shared ideological commitment to women's rights and financial incentives for those who provided services. The family's research revealed that this underground network had been remarkably sophisticated and effective. It had operated for several decades, helping thousands of women escape difficult circumstances and create new lives. The network had been particularly important during periods when legal and social protections for women were limited, providing an alternative system of support and assistance. Clara's role in this network had made her a significant figure in the early women's rights movement, though her contributions had been largely hidden from history. Her work had required her to maintain multiple identities and relationships, carefully balancing her public persona as a respectable widow with her covert activities as an organizer and advocate. The family discovered that Clara had been particularly skilled at identifying women who were in need of help and connecting them with the appropriate resources. She had developed a network of contacts throughout the region and had maintained detailed records of the services available in different communities. This information had been invaluable in helping women find safe places to start new lives. The research also revealed that Clara had been involved in several high-profile cases that had attracted national attention. In 1918, she had helped a young woman named Emma Goldman escape from federal authorities who were seeking to deport her for her political activities. In 1925, she had provided assistance to a group of women who had been involved in a labor strike that had turned violent. These cases had required Clara to use all of her skills in creating false identities and maintaining secrecy. She had needed to coordinate with activists and lawyers in multiple states, arrange for safe transportation, and provide temporary shelter and financial support. The success of these operations had enhanced her reputation within the network and had led to her being entrusted with increasingly important responsibilities. The family's research also uncovered evidence that Clara had been involved in international activities, helping women who were fleeing persecution in Europe find refuge in the United States. During the 1920s and 1930s, she had worked with Jewish organizations to help women escape anti-Semitic violence, and during World War II, she had assisted refugees who were fleeing Nazi persecution. This international work had required Clara to develop contacts with immigration officials, shipping companies, and foreign consulates. She had needed to understand complex immigration laws and procedures, and she had often needed to provide financial guarantees for the women she was helping. The scope of this work demonstrated the extent of Clara's commitment to helping women in need, regardless of their nationality or background. The family discovered that Clara's house in Millbrook had been used as a safe house for women in transition throughout her lifetime. The house had been carefully designed to accommodate temporary residents with hidden rooms and secret passages that could be used to conceal women who were being pursued by authorities or abusive family members. The basement of the house had been converted into a medical facility where Clara could provide care for women who were pregnant or recovering from injuries. She had maintained a supply of medical equipment and medications, and she had developed relationships with sympathetic doctors who could provide more advanced care when necessary. The family also found evidence that Clara had operated a small school in her home, providing education and job training for women who needed to develop new skills to support themselves. The curriculum had included basic literacy and numeracy, as well as practical skills such as typing, bookkeeping, and domestic work that could lead to employment. This educational work had been particularly important for women who had been denied access to formal education or who needed to develop new skills to succeed in different communities. Clara had been a skilled teacher, and many of the women she had helped had gone on to successful careers and independent lives. The family's research revealed that Clara's network had been remarkably resilient and had continued to operate even during periods of increased government surveillance and social conservatism. The network had adapted to changing circumstances by developing new methods of communication and by shifting its focus to different types of assistance as social conditions changed. During the Great Depression, the network had focused on helping women find employment and housing during a period of widespread economic hardship. During World War II, it had shifted its attention to helping women who were dealing with the disruption caused by the war, including wives of servicemen who were struggling to support their families and women who were entering the workforce for the first time. The family discovered that Clara had been instrumental in adapting the network to these changing circumstances. She had been skilled at identifying emerging needs and developing new programs to address them. Her ability to maintain relationships with a diverse group of contacts had been crucial in ensuring that the network could continue to operate effectively. The research also revealed that Clara had been involved in training other women to take on leadership roles within the network. She had developed a formal mentorship program that paired experienced organizers with newcomers, ensuring that the network's knowledge and expertise would be passed on to future generations. This training program had been particularly important in ensuring the network's continuity as its original leaders aged and retired. Clara had been careful to document the network's methods and procedures, creating a body of institutional knowledge that could be used by future organizers. The family found evidence that Clara had been recognized by her peers as one of the most effective organizers in the network. She had received numerous letters of appreciation from women she had helped, and she had been invited to speak at conferences and meetings throughout the region. Despite this recognition, Clara had been careful to maintain her public persona as a simple widow living quietly in a small town. She had understood that her effectiveness depended on her ability to operate without attracting attention from authorities or conservative groups that opposed her activities. The family's research revealed that Clara's work had had a lasting impact on the lives of the women she had helped. Many of the women had gone on to successful careers and had become advocates for women's rights in their own communities. Some had become teachers, nurses, and social workers, while others had started businesses or become involved in politics. The network that Clara had helped to build had also had a broader impact on society, contributing to the gradual expansion of opportunities and rights for women throughout the 20th century. The network's emphasis on education, economic independence, and political participation had helped to lay the groundwork for the modern women's rights movement. The family discovered that Clara had maintained contact with many of the women she had helped throughout her life, following their progress and celebrating their successes. She had kept detailed records of their achievements, creating an informal alumni network that had provided ongoing support and encouragement. This ongoing relationship had been important for both Clara and the women she had helped. For Clara, it had provided validation that her work was making a real difference in people's lives. For the women, it had provided a continuing connection to someone who understood their struggles and supported their goals. The family's research also revealed that Clara had been involved in documenting the history of the network and the women it had helped. She had collected photographs, letters, and other documents that told the stories of individual women and the broader movement of which they had been part. This documentation had been carefully preserved and hidden, ensuring that the history of the network would not be lost even if the organization itself was discovered or disbanded. Clara had understood the importance of preserving these stories for future generations of women who might face similar challenges. The family realized that their discovery of Clara's fake wedding photograph had been just the beginning of uncovering a much larger and more significant story. Clara had not been simply a woman who had created a false identity to escape scandal. She had been a pioneering advocate for women's rights who had dedicated her life to helping other women achieve independence and dignity. The fake wedding photograph, which had initially seemed like a simple deception, now appeared to be a symbol of Clara's broader commitment to helping women create new identities and new lives. The photograph had been both a practical tool that had helped Clara establish her own credibility and a representation of the kind of transformation that she had helped to make possible for hundreds of other women. The family's research had revealed that Clara's story was part of a larger narrative about women's struggle for equality and independence in the early 20th century. Her work had been part of a broader movement that had challenged traditional social norms and had created new opportunities for women to control their own destinies. The discovery of Clara's true identity and her role in the underground network had given the family a new appreciation for the courage and determination of women in previous generations. Clara's story had shown that women had not been passive victims of social constraints, but had been active agents in creating change and expanding opportunities for themselves and others. The family decided to continue their research into Clara's story and the broader network of which she had been part. They hoped to contribute to a better understanding of women's history and to help preserve the stories of women who had made significant contributions to social progress, but whose work had been largely hidden from public view. As the family delved deeper into the archives and records that Clara had left behind, they discovered additional layers to her remarkable story. Among her papers, they found correspondence with prominent figures of the early women's rights movement, including letters from Susan B. Anthony and Frances Willard, indicating that Clara's influence had extended far beyond the local network they had initially uncovered. These letters revealed that Clara had been consulted on matters of national importance within the movement, and that her expertise in helping women create new identities had been recognized by the most prominent leaders of the time. The correspondence showed that Clara had been invited to participate in national conferences and had been asked to contribute to publications about women's rights and social reform. One particularly significant letter from Susan B. Anthony, dated 1915, praised Clara for her innovative work in helping women escape abusive situations and create independent lives. The letter mentioned that Clara's methods had been studied and adopted by women's organizations in other states, and that her approach had become a model for similar networks throughout the country. The family also discovered that Clara had been involved in establishing what may have been one of the first formal networks for helping victims of domestic violence. Long before such support systems were recognized or legally protected, Clara had been working with other women to create safe houses and support networks for women fleeing abusive marriages. This work had been particularly dangerous, as it had often involved helping women escape from powerful and influential men who had the resources to pursue them. Clara had developed sophisticated methods for concealing the identities and locations of the women she was helping, and she had created a network of contacts who could provide assistance in different parts of the country. The family found evidence that Clara had been involved in several cases that had required her to work with law enforcement officials who were sympathetic to the plight of abused women. While domestic violence was not widely recognized as a serious crime in the early 1900s, Clara had been able to find police officers and judges who were willing to help women escape dangerous situations. One case that was particularly well documented involved a woman named Elizabeth Sterling, whose husband had been a prominent businessman in Philadelphia. Elizabeth had been severely beaten by her husband and had feared for her life, but she had been unable to obtain legal protection because of her husband's influence and social standing. Clara had helped Elizabeth create a new identity and had arranged for her to be relocated to a small town in Ohio, where she had been able to start a new life under an assumed name. The case had required Clara to coordinate with contacts in multiple states and had involved creating false documentation that would allow Elizabeth to obtain employment and housing under her new identity. The success of this case had led to Clara being contacted by women's organizations in other cities who were dealing with similar situations. Clara had shared her methods and had helped to establish similar networks in other parts of the country, creating a national system of support for women who needed to escape abusive relationships. The family's research also revealed that Clara had been involved in efforts to change laws that discriminated against women. She had worked with lawyers and legislators to draft legislation that would make it easier for women to obtain divorces in cases of abuse, and she had lobbied for laws that would protect women's property rights and custody rights. This legal work had been particularly challenging, as it had required Clara to work within a system that was dominated by men and that often did not take women's concerns seriously. Clara had been skilled at building coalitions and had been able to find male allies who were willing to support her efforts to change discriminatory laws. One of Clara's most significant legal victories had been her involvement in a case that had established an important precedent for women's property rights. The case had involved a woman whose husband had died and whose in-laws had attempted to claim her property and custody of her children. Clara had helped the woman find legal representation and had provided financial support for the lengthy court battle that had followed. The case had ultimately been decided in favor of the woman, establishing a precedent that had protected the rights of other widows in similar situations. The victory had been widely reported in newspapers throughout the region and had brought national attention to the issue of women's property rights. The family discovered that Clara had also been involved in efforts to improve working conditions for women in factories and other industrial settings. She had worked with labor organizers to document unsafe working conditions and had helped to organize strikes and protests that had led to improvements in workplace safety and wages. This labor organizing work had been particularly dangerous, as it had often put Clara in conflict with powerful business interests who had the resources to retaliate against those who challenged them. Clara had needed to be careful to protect her identity and had often worked through intermediaries to avoid direct confrontation with employers. The family found evidence that Clara had been involved in organizing a major strike at a textile factory in Philadelphia in 1912. The strike had been prompted by unsafe working conditions that had led to several serious injuries, and Clara had helped to coordinate the workers' demands for improved safety measures and higher wages. The strike had lasted for several weeks and had attracted national attention to the issue of workplace safety for women. Clara had helped to organize support for the striking workers and had arranged for financial assistance to help them survive during the work stoppage. The strike had ultimately been successful, leading to significant improvements in working conditions and wages at the factory. The victory had inspired similar strikes at other factories throughout the region and had contributed to the broader labor movement that was fighting for workers' rights. The family's research also revealed that Clara had been involved in efforts to improve access to education for women and girls. She had worked with educators and reformers to establish schools and training programs that would provide women with the skills they needed to support themselves independently. This educational work had been particularly important for women who had been denied access to formal education because of their social circumstances or economic status. Clara had been instrumental in establishing scholarship programs that had allowed poor women to attend school and had helped to create vocational training programs that had prepared women for careers in fields that had previously been closed to them. One of Clara's most significant educational achievements had been her involvement in establishing a teacher training program for women who wanted to work in rural communities. The program had provided intensive training in both academic subjects and practical skills, and it had placed teachers in communities throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The program had been particularly successful in reaching communities that had previously had limited access to education, and many of the teachers who had been trained through the program had gone on to establish schools and educational programs in their own communities. The family discovered that Clara had also been involved in efforts to improve access to health care for women, particularly in rural areas where medical care was often limited or unavailable. She had worked with doctors and nurses to establish clinics and training programs that had provided basic medical care to women who might not otherwise have had access to it. This healthcare work had been particularly important for women who were pregnant or who had young children, as maternal and infant mortality rates had been very high in the early 1900s. Clara had helped to train midwives and had established programs that had provided prenatal care and education to expectant mothers. The family found evidence that Clara had been involved in establishing one of the first family planning clinics in Pennsylvania. The clinic had provided information about contraception and had offered medical care related to reproductive health, services that had been controversial and often illegal at the time. The clinic had operated in secret for several years, providing services to women who had no other access to reproductive health care. Clara had helped to fund the clinic and had provided protection for the doctors and nurses who had worked there, often at great personal risk. The family's research revealed that Clara's work had extended far beyond the borders of Pennsylvania. She had maintained correspondence with women's organizations throughout the United States and had been involved in efforts to coordinate activities between different groups working for women's rights. This national network had been particularly important during World War I, when many traditional support systems had been disrupted by the war effort. Clara had helped to coordinate efforts to provide assistance to women whose husbands had been killed or injured in the war, and she had worked to ensure that women who had entered the workforce to support the war effort would be able to maintain their economic independence after the war ended. The family discovered that Clara had been involved in organizing one of the first national conferences on women's rights, which had been held in Washington, D.C. in 1920. The conference had brought together women's rights activists from throughout the country and had helped to coordinate efforts to secure passage of the 19th Amendment, which had given women the right to vote. Clara had been one of the organizers of the conference and had been responsible for coordinating the participation of women's groups from the northeastern states. The conference had been a major success and had helped to build momentum for the final push to secure women's suffrage. The family's research also revealed that Clara had continued her activism well into the 1960s, long after most people would have expected someone of her age to retire from such demanding work. She had been involved in the early civil rights movement and had worked to support efforts to end racial discrimination. This civil rights work had been a natural extension of Clara's lifelong commitment to helping marginalized people overcome discrimination and achieve equality. She had applied the same skills and methods that she had used to help women create new identities, to help African Americans who were facing persecution and discrimination. The family found evidence that Clara had been involved in helping to establish some of the first integrated schools in Pennsylvania. She had worked with civil rights organizations to identify communities where integration efforts were most likely to succeed, and she had helped to provide financial and logistical support for families who were willing to challenge segregation. This work had been particularly dangerous, as it had put Clara in conflict with white supremacist groups who had been violently opposed to integration. Clara had needed to use all of her skills in maintaining secrecy and protecting identities to keep the families she was helping safe from retaliation. The family discovered that Clara had also been involved in efforts to improve economic opportunities for African Americans. She had worked with business leaders and community organizations to create job training programs and to establish businesses that would provide employment for African Americans who had been excluded from other opportunities. This economic development work had been particularly important in helping to build the economic foundation that had been necessary for the civil rights movement to succeed. Clara had understood that political equality would be meaningless without economic independence, and she had worked to ensure that African Americans would have the resources they needed to support themselves and their families. The family's research revealed that Clara had been recognized for her civil rights work by several national organizations. She had received awards from the NAACP and other civil rights groups, and she had been invited to speak at conferences and meetings throughout the country. Despite this recognition, Clara had continued to maintain her low profile in Millbrook, where most people had remained unaware of the full extent of her activities. She had understood that her effectiveness depended on her ability to operate without attracting too much attention, and she had been careful to keep her various activities separate from each other. As the family continued to piece together Clara's story, they began to understand the full scope of her remarkable life. She had been involved in virtually every major social justice movement of her time, and she had made significant contributions to efforts to expand rights and opportunities for women, minorities, and other marginalized groups. The fake wedding photograph that had started their investigation had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Clara had used deception and false identities not for personal gain, but as tools in a lifelong campaign to help others overcome discrimination and achieve equality. The family realized that Clara's story was not just a family mystery, but an important piece of American social history. Her work had contributed to many of the social changes that had transformed American society during the 20th century, and her methods had influenced generations of activists and reformers. The discovery of Clara's true identity and the full extent of her work had given the family a new understanding of their heritage and a new appreciation for the courage and determination of their ancestor. Clara's story had shown them that one person could make a significant difference in the world, even when working in secret and without recognition. The fake wedding photograph would continue to serve as a symbol of Clara's remarkable life and her commitment to helping others. It represented not just a clever deception, but a powerful statement about the lengths to which people will go to protect their families and fight for justice. The family's journey of discovery had also taught them important lessons about the nature of history and the importance of preserving and investigating family artifacts. They had learned that the stories passed down through generations might not always be complete or accurate, and that careful research could reveal hidden truths that enriched their understanding of the past. Clara's story had demonstrated that history was not just about famous people and major events, but about the countless individuals who had worked behind the scenes to create change and improve the lives of others. Her work had been largely invisible to historians and the general public, but it had been no less important for its secrecy. The family decided to continue sharing Clara's story with researchers, historians, and museums to help ensure that her contributions would not be forgotten. They hoped that Clara's example would inspire others to look more carefully at their own family histories and to consider the possibility that their ancestors might have been involved in important social movements and causes. The fake wedding photograph that had started their investigation would be preserved as a reminder of Clara's remarkable life and as a symbol of the power of deception when used in service of a greater good. It would continue to tell the story of a woman who had refused to be limited by the social constraints of her time and who had dedicated her life to helping others achieve freedom and equality. In the end, the Henderson family's discovery of their great-grandmother's fake wedding photograph had led them to uncover one of the most remarkable stories of social activism and reform in American history. Clara's deception had been motivated not by shame or selfishness, but by a deep commitment to justice and equality that had shaped every aspect of her long and extraordinary life. The photograph would remain a treasured family heirloom, but its story would be shared with the world as a testament to the power of individual action and the importance of fighting for what is right, even when that fight must be conducted in secret. Clara's legacy would live on through the countless lives she had touched and the social changes she had helped to bring about, proving that even the most carefully guarded secrets could ultimately serve the cause of truth and justice.